Mark, obviously the pressure from the U.S. government on big tech in general has been ratcheting up. How much does this latest salvo from the U.S. government change the equation?
I like your expression, Emily. It just ratchets up the pressure on these companies, and it's become clearly a bipartisan issue. You noticed that in the congressional hearings in the middle of the summer. It was what I called a opening of a congressional bipartisan can of whoop ass on big tech. It's Republicans and Democrats. So yeah, these companies have clearly become very large, very powerful, and there are legitimate questions as to whether they've become too large, too powerful, both in terms of their acquisitions and in their internal practices. Privacy issues are a little bit separate, but the scrutiny is super high, and at least it very much limits the ability of these companies to do any large-scale acquisitions.
This statement from the FTC today: the decisions that prominent online platforms make regarding consumer and customer data remain shrouded in secrecy. Critical questions about business models, algorithms, data collection, and use have gone unanswered. Policymakers and the public are in the dark about what social media and video streaming services do to capture and sell users' data and attention. It is alarming that we still know so little about companies that know so much about us. As somebody who has covered these companies for so many years, I'm sure this is probably the height of scrutiny that you have seen on these companies from the U.S. government. How big a risk should investors take this into their calculations when they're thinking about whether to invest in these companies at already high valuations?
Well, let's see. Regulatory issues aren't necessarily new. Google is paid, I think, about $10 billion now in fines. Facebook is paid. Those are European fines. Facebook is paid about $5 to $6 billion in the U.S. to the FTC for violating a consent decree or acknowledging that it may have violated a consent decree. So investors are used to fines. Investors are used to this kind of scrutiny. So I don't think it changes the investment thesis on this name. You'd have to really have a required breakup or a required change in business practices. But Emily, you've tracked this industry for a long time. A lot of these models, it's kind of a trade-off for consumers. If you want a free service, you have to give up some of your privacy. You have to give information. And by the way, in many ways, I think it actually makes the service a lot better. You get targeted ads rather than junk mail. And I think most consumers prefer the targeted ads. How, in fact, they get the information to target the ads, that's kind of the secret sauce for a lot of these businesses, and they'd rather not tell regulators or anybody that for competitive reasons, but they may be forced to now because of regulators. And so anyway, that's the new issue. But I don't think it changes the investment thesis on this name for investors.
What about the risk in particular of Facebook being broken up, given that the FTC, certainly it's not required, but the FTC has suggested that could be a remedy, spinning off Instagram, spinning off WhatsApp?
Well, one of the smoking guns, Emily, that came out of those congressional hearings this summer, and by the way, it was already brought up in a couple of really great books that have been published in the last year or two about Facebook and Instagram, particularly Sarah Fryer's book, is that there's no question that Facebook bought Instagram in part to take out what they perceived as a potential future competitor. And so those are the things that antitrust laws are sort of meant to stop or to at least address. Why it wasn't addressed the first time the FTC looked at that acquisition is a little bit of a mystery. But anyway, that's it does raise the issue that these will be forced breakups. I think the breakup of WhatsApp is a little harder to see what the rationale for that would be. It's not clearly in the same industry as Facebook. That was kind of more of an orthogonal acquisition, but the pressure is going to be there. I think it's unlikely there'll be required spinoffs, but it is possible.
Now, you just put out a note on Uber, and you are pretty bullish on how they come out of the pandemic. Why?
I'm sorry, Emily. Let's see. On Uber, this remains our top pick in the group. We have noticed this multi-year rise in the interest of ride sharing. What I found most interesting from this report and this survey was the finding that consumers are finding new use cases for ride sharing. Dara Khosrowshahi, he talked about this on the last earnings call, that New Yorkers, he was specifically pointing to, were starting to use ride sharing during the middle of the day during non-peak commute times. Our surveys showed that people were starting to use ride sharing to run errands. If that use case continues post-COVID, and then you have your general use cases rising, for social events, for airport runs. What it means is that the use cases for ride sharing, for Uber, for Lyft, all in are going to be greater post-COVID, whenever post-COVID is. I thought that was an unusually bullish takeaway. So we continue to like Uber. It's our top pick in large cap.
Now, interesting, Uber's obviously one of the companies that has struggled in the midst of the pandemic.
Yeah.
Stitch Fix is another company that you're looking at that struggled early on as well, made big job cuts, but seems to be taking off like a rocket ship. What are you seeing in terms of the path ahead there?
So that's going to be a COVID recovery play. Online retail as a category, Emily, just accelerated like a rocket ship throughout COVID, except for fashion and apparel, because we didn't want to buy clothes to go out because we weren't going out. But now we're starting to think about going out. There's been a lot of pent up dollars. I think people will be looking to refresh their wardrobes. And in the meantime, I think Stitch Fix, Katrina Lake, that company, I think they've done a lot of product improvements. And to me, that's what innovation, product improvements really drive value to for these companies over time. And I think investors kind of may have underappreciated some of the changes that they've made. The site is more personalized. They figured out new features. They've kind of gamified the service a little bit. And I think as you come out of COVID, you'll see a really nice, sharp recovery in both new users and in revenue at Stitch Fix. This has been one of our top picks in small cap. We've had a dramatic surge in the shares, so it's become a pretty small buy for us now. But fundamentally, it's a much stronger asset. It will be coming out of COVID than it was coming in. That's why investors are excited.
Now, you've been covering tech a long time, Mark, and I'm sure you followed the Airbnb and DoorDash IPOs last week, doubling their valuations. Even Brian Chesky, the CEO, seemed stunned when I told him live on air where the shares were about to open at. As we head into 2021, are you concerned about froth in the market? We're already looking at a couple of companies, Affirm and Roblox, that are postponing their IPOs till next year as they try to get a sense of what is happening in this market.
Well, yeah, this is unusual what we've seen. I don't have a formal opinion on either Airbnb and or DoorDash. I want to look at names this year which have risen a lot, but because their estimates have gone up. So I look at a good classic case like a Facebook or an Amazon. It's not so much the re-rating. We haven't seen these multiples fly to the moon. What we've seen is the numbers have gone up. Everybody's estimates on the street for Amazon have gone up materially since the beginning of the year because their revenue growth accelerated. There were big winners off of advertising and the cloud computing business. All three of their engines of growth have actually benefited from COVID. So I think there's less risk in a good, solid name like that. And my guess is that you'll see kind of a recovery back, a return by investors back to kind of the standard bearers of tech, especially those that benefited, but also came up with new investment initiatives during the course of the year. Again, Amazon's the poster child here. They're increasing their distribution capacity by 50% this year. They really leaned into COVID. And I think what's going to come out of that for them is accelerated market share gains. So I think investors can still stick with that name and it'll continue to outperform for them despite already outperforming this year.